Hello. I know I'm a big fat stinking liar, so I apologize for being a big fat stinking liar because I said that my plan was to finish this series by the end of 2018, and here it is in the second month of 2019, and I still haven't even finished this book. So I am really sorry if you were waiting on that. Hello, Tori. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. So all of that to say, I'm very sorry if I have greatly disappointed anybody that was, on the edge of their seats hoping to finish this series. Um, but, life happens. December was much busier than I anticipated. Um, and then January was just crazy getting school started and everything, so all of you guys who are in school probably understand that. Um, Thanks. Thanks for forgiving me. At least one person does. Everybody on YouTube probably hates my guts. But, so, in case you can't remember, we are in book 5 of the Enola Holmes mystery series. The Case of the Cryptic Crinoline, which I still am not positive if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I did so many Google searches before starting this book to make sure that I would pronounce it right. And apparently there's multiple pronunciations, so... But just to recap, because I do read comments on YouTube, all 2 of them, so, and especially since it's been so long, I will recap the last little bit of this book. So, where we left off is, Enola's landlady has been kidnapped, and she has been trying to figure out who it is, who has taken her, and why they've taken her. And she discovered that Mrs. Tupper, her landlady, was in possession of a crinoline that had embroidery on the ribbon, which was a secret message that was given to her by Florence Nightingale. So Florence Nightingale has been this kind of integral mystery woman that Enola has tracked down. She was able to get an audience with her and discussed with her, found out that this, allegedly feeble old lady was not that. She just didn't want to see a whole lot of visitors, and was actually, much more influential in the war, running kind of this, being a part of this kind of spy ring in the war. And Florence Nightingale, where we left off, Florence Nightingale said that she was going to employ the assistance of Sherlock Holmes to try and help find Mrs. Tupper. So Sherlock Holmes was there at Florence Nightingale's house with Enola there, and Enola took off running, left the house, realized that she couldn't go back to Dr. Ragaston's office because that would lead Sherlock directly to her hiding place. So she, where we last left off, Enola was kind of thinking to herself like she's in danger of losing her freedom, but she has to find Mrs. Tupper, like that's the most important thing, and so she, still has the secret message, and so she's decided she's going to finish decoding it. So we are on the 11th chapter of this book, and in this stream we're going to finish the rest of this story, which it's actually not very long, so if I have enough time. My clock is dead, so I keep looking up to see the time, and but I do have a clock on my computer, so I could just look right there. If we have the time, I would like to get started on the following book, the last book of the series. So if that's the case, then I will oblige happily. But there are, let me check. Let's see. Alright, so there's 14 chapters, an epilogue, and an author's note. And we are on chapter 11, so not much left of this book. But without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. Just making sure a couple things here. Alrighty, so. I'm sorry if my if I'm wiping my nose a lot, if that's distracting for you, but it's a little runny. I know that's TMI. But, anyways, sorry. Chapter the 11th. I needed a copy of the Morse code. Where could I go to find one? The British Museum? Oh, wow. More words. I think maybe this is just an expression. Like, when people go, pfft, but it's spelled like this. And it's just, that's it, just one word. But, phooey, maybe, is that what it means? A den of nasty old men. I need a haven, a sanctuary. And I also, badly, as I had partaken of none of Mrs. Nightingale's scones, needed something to eat. Finally, my mind resumed functioning properly, for such a welcome thought occurred to me that I actually smiled. Exiting the underground at the appropriate station, I sought a secluded corner and tidied myself a bit, then walked out again into London streets, looking smartly about me. There was no sign of the pleasant-faced villain who had been following me, or of any other danger. Making towards the main thoroughfare, I hailed a cab. High Street, I told the cabby, for I did not wish to sing out for all the world to hear my precise destination. A bit later, with a sigh of relief, I walked into London's, and perhaps the world's, first professional women's club. I had not been here before, but I knew of the place by reputation. Just as men's clubs admitted no women, this small fortress admitted no men. But whereas men's clubs require new members to be sponsored by the old, the professional women's club democratically welcomed any female who could pay the membership fee, which was quite substantial enough to keep out the undesirable classes. After writing a check and receiving my membership card, I went on in, had a look around at the comfortable appointments of the sanctuary, nodded at a few other members, the younger ones I noticed clad much as I was, ordered tea and sandwiches, and settled myself in the library with the volume M of the encyclopedia. Several hours, more tea, and another tray of sandwiches later. Here is the bottom of the page. So if you want to pause it and decipher your Morse code, please go ahead. But there might be more on this page too. So, here you go. If you're ready, here's the next bit. Oops, sorry, I'm cutting it off. There we go. There you go. So now I'm sure you've already decoded that very rapidly. Turned out as follows. Have proof. Werford selling supplies, Constantinople. Market appealed, Crookshanks Hall, Raglan no avail, officers callous or worse, profiting, while men freeze, starve, die. Beg you, use influence, VR, despairing, FN. FN was of course Florence Nightingale, and VR was Victoria Regina, that is to say, Queen Victoria. But Werford? Crookshanks? Hall? Raglan? Crimean conflict in the volume C of the Britannica gave me to know that Crookshanks was a general in that war. Hall, the chief medical examiner, Werford, the army's remarkably inefficient purveyor, and Raglan, the charming but utterly incompetent commander of the whole bloody mess, as exemplified by the charge of the Light Brigade, hundreds of cavalrymen sent galloping to death due to an error in orders. Looking at my suspects individually, I discovered that, like Lord Sidney Wimbrel, they were deceased, beyond my reach to locate or question. What, therefore, was I now to do? I had no idea, for presence of mind was difficult to maintain. Willy-nilly, even though I knew it was most unlikely that he could have traced me here. Nevertheless, I kept imagining Sherlock Holmes waiting to pounce upon me the moment I set foot outside the door. So disturbing were these thoughts that I could not sit still. I roamed the professional women's club, the pleasant modern oriental furnishings of reading room, card room, tea room, and the morning room, lost upon me as I fretted, imagining the most grotesque scenarios involving my brother Sherlock, Miss Nightingale, Mycroft, Dr. Watson, Scotland Yard, magistrates in white wigs, and ghoulish boarding school matrons ad infinitum. Enola, this will not do. I needed to think about Mrs. Tupper. In order to force myself to do so, I realized I must make a list. So, taking the nearest seat on a chintz-upholstered camelback sofa, very chic, for I found myself in a charming little drawing room, where a few older women had gathered to chat. With paper and pencil in hand I began to write. Where is Mrs. Tupper? Who is classic profile? whose brougham took her away, for what purpose, to speak with whom, etc. I started out, as I am sure the gentle reader can see, rather stupid, partly because I was so perturbed of mind, and partly because of the distraction of pleasant, intelligent voices conversing all around me. For instance, a tall woman in a loose, comfortable, aesthetic dress, with her grey hair flowing down her back, was saying, "Poor dear Rodney, such a pleasant, well-meaning gentleman, yet sorely lacking in backbone, while his younger brother—" "One must wonder," put in a different woman with a laugh, "how the theory of evolution would account for all the powers being given to the older brother, yet all the potency to the younger." "That's not evolution, dear, that's our ridiculous laws of primogeniture. Primogeniture. Wow. Here's your SAT word for the day. I'll spell it out for you. Whoa, I lost my spot. There you go. It's your SAT word for the day. And hello, I think that's Summer. Yes, hi Summer. Good to see you. Thank you for joining. "It's a shame," said another of the elderly women, "for Rodney will do almost anything Joffrey says, and Joffrey's strength of character is not always the best of character, or so I have heard." Why was I listening to the gossip of people I didn't even know, when I so badly needed to think? Yet I could not seem to shut my ears. I knew I should move to another room, yet I did not. A comfortable, matronly voice was saying, "Yes, his dear mother would be sorely dismayed, but then good character in that family has generally run on the female side." Well, doesn't it generally in any civilized family? There was a ripple of laughter, during which the gray-haired aesthetic woman remarked, "Speaking of good families and characters, has anyone heard anything of Lady Eudora Holmes?" My mother! Hearing her name spoken aloud in such a comfortable, offhand fashion, I felt such a pang to my heart that for a moment I couldn't breathe. The world spun. I might faint. Nonsense. I never faint. I must not miss a word. Making a great effort to control my speeding pulse and panting breath, I stiffened, eavesdropping intently, although I did not dare to look around at the speakers. "No news of her at all since she disappeared. One does not know whether she is yet alive." "Oh, I'm sure she's alive all right," put in a third good-humored voice. "She's far too strong-minded to lie down and die just yet. I imagine she took off, as the youngsters would say." A murmur of agreement sounded all around. "I hope so," said the aesthetic woman. "I hope she's finally had a chance to live her life on her own terms." These women had been friends of my mother. Friends of my mother! How peculiarly that simple thought, and their proximity worked upon my sensibilities. Every fiber of my being ached with longing. How I wished I could feel as confidently as they that Mum was alive and well, and enjoying herself. "Perhaps she's gone overseas," said the good-humored woman. "She always yearned to travel." I had never known that. "If so, let us hope she wanders far from the Balkans. Trouble there, as always. There and here. I've heard that someone is endeavoring to stir up some sort of Crimean War scandal. Again? But why would anyone wish to dredge up that ruck of muck now?" "Why, indeed? I'm sure I have no idea. Is it about Werford again, perhaps? Any rehashing of that sordid affair would be most injurious. Today's progressive spirit—" As they spoke of politics and reform, at last I was able to turn a deaf ear to the conversation, dismiss my thoughts and feelings regarding Mum. I had become quite adept at doing this, and right. What turn of events started this dreadful business? Who wanted Mrs. Tupper to deliver her message, and why? Who stood to benefit? Enemies of reform? To embarrass Florence Nightingale? Who knew that Mrs. Tupper, of all people, had a message for the bird? That brought me up short, pencil poised in the air as I stared at nothing, for at last, you see, I had asked myself the right question. Who knew of the existence of the Cryptic Crinoline? Given that no regular carriers for the bird were involved, and Mrs. Tupper herself evidently did not realize her fine apparel's significance. Who knew? Certainly not Werford, Crookshanks, Hall, or Raglan, or their heirs. When a message is sent in secret code, who must have knowledge of it? The sender, and the carrier, usually. And the person to whom the message is being sent might perhaps know that he should be in readiness to receive it. Florence Nightingale knew. I wrote. Miss Nightingale did not remember Mrs. Tupper by name. Miss Nightingale hired Sherlock Holmes to find Mrs. Tupper. Personal impression. Miss Nightingale was not lying to me. Reasonable supposition. Miss Nightingale is not guilty. Very well. If Miss Nightingale had not kidnapped my landlady, and obviously Mrs. Tupper had not instigated her own abduction, there remained only Lord Sidney Wimbrel. But he is Miss Nightingale's ally, or was, because he is now deceased. I objected to myself aloud, albeit in a whisper, and then trying to joke, unless his ghost, no joke. I had seen, and indeed I had been followed by a man sufficiently identical to the late Sidney Wimbrel, or at least to his silhouette, to be his ghost. But as ghosts did not exist in the rational world of a scientific Prototorian, then that man, the one who had burgled a blue dress in the night, and who, according to Florry, had carried off Mrs. Tupper, might be Lord Sidney Wimbrel's kin, most likely his son? Nonsense, I argued with myself. The Wimbrels were amongst the most honoured and respected of the titled British families. The idea of any scion of the Wimbrel family consorting with a common villain to abuse and kidnap my deaf and elderly landlady was preposterous. But who else could it have been? And hadn't Florence Nightingale said something about protecting the Wimbrel family? And about young Wimbrel having recently been admitted to the House of Lords? Also, hadn't the ill-matched pair of miscreants burglaring Mrs. Tupper's house said something sarcastic about his lordship? Oh, my stars and garters, I whispered, realizing that, however preposterous it was, yet it had to be. That's what started this imbroglio. There's another SAT word for you. There we go. A few minutes later, in the Professional Women's Club library, I found myself quite thoughtful as I replaced Boyle's upon the shelf and pocketed the address I had copied out of that useful reference book upon the members of the peerage. My thoughts were manifold, astonished, and terrified. Such being the case, I also found myself contemplating with dark amusement the 18th century philosophers, Alexander Pope and his ilk, who insisted that everything is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. In other words, if the baby dies, one must tell oneself that things would have been much worse had it lived. If thousands of orphans are starving in the poorhouse, surely it is for some higher purpose. And in my case, if I found myself hunted, on the run, unable to go home and sleep in my own bed, well then, wasn't it wonderful that I had somewhere else to go tonight? I had learned, amongst other most interesting revelations, the address of the Wimbrels' townhouse, where I quite hoped to find Mrs. Tupper. And that's the end of chapter 11. Thanks for being here, Summer. I hope you're doing well. You are a decoding genius, Tori. We know that. So, I'm going to take a sip of... I'm having tea today out of my special cup. This is not a teacup. It's a coffee cup, but, you know, I'm an American, so it doesn't matter. I do actually have a British teacup, so all of you haters can just calm down. I did buy one in London last time I was there, so I'm not cheating. I do have a real one. Alrighty. We're going to go ahead and press on. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, just checking to make sure my stream is working okay. I always get so nervous that I'm going and have just forgotten to hit start streaming or something, and I'm just sitting here reading to nobody. But you're there, so if there's tea in it, it's a teacup. That's very true. Yep. And thank you. Alright. Pressing on. Chapter the 12th. Wimbrel Hall stood, a lordly white, four-towered mansion. Oh, excuse me. Excuse me one sec. Sorry. That was one of my classmates. Chapter the 12th. Wimbrel Hall stood, a lordly white four-towered mansion in Mayfair, only a block away from Florence Nightingale's house. At nightfall, still carrying my old brown leather satchel and still dressed in the same dark frock I had thrown on that morning, standing across the tree-lined street in the shadow of a friendly oak to study Wimbrel Hall, I wondered whether its address might have been the one written upon a card that Florence Nightingale had given to Mrs. Tupper amidst the horrors of Scutari so long ago. An Italianate mansion with its multiple coins? I'm sure it's an architectural term. And brackets, looking temptingly simple to climb. But climbing, I had to remind myself, is not the answer to everything. Even if I could scale the fence, evade the inevitable watchdog, swarm up the mansion, find entry, avoid detection or capture, and succeed in locating Mrs. Tupper, what then? I could hardly expect her to clamber out of a tower window and down its wall along with me. Generally, I managed to accomplish whatever I wanted, either by stealth or by bribery. But, in this case, as these people had quite enough money without any help from me, neither would do. And I needed to steel myself to try something I had never done before. I had discovered, you see, from Boyles, that Lord Sidney Wimbrel had been survived by 2 sons, the elder of whom, and the new Lord Wimbrel, was named Rodney, and the younger of whom was named Geoffrey. Name sound familiar? Now the conversation I had chanced to overhear in the Professional Women's Club assumed utmost importance in my mind. Rodney? Geoffrey? Surely not coincidence, especially as the former had recently taken a seat in the House of Lords, providing reason to be gossiped about. As Rodney, according to the ladies, was the good-hearted brother, I had decided my best course would be to appeal directly to him for Mrs. Tupper's release, if the younger, yet less scrupulous Geoffrey had not dispatched her already. While I hated to think that any son of the revered Lord Sidney Wimbrel could be capable of such infamy, still, once he had kidnapped her and attempted to extract information from her, then, confound logic, anyway, it made my heart ache. And what if he had led me utterly astray? What if I were to sashay up to the door of Wimbrel Hall and either make an utter fool of myself or never come out again? Enola, you must be quite sure of yourself, or you will never pull it off. Now go over it all again, one step at a time. And as I did so, in my mind, I noticed that I was not the only loiterer on the street. Puttering along, investigating the gutter, as if he hoped to find something of value there, came a genteel greybeard sort of poor soul, not quite a beggar, his threadbare clothing that of a gentleman, cadaverous, yet walking with a cane, tall but greatly bent by age, his untrimmed whiskers hiding most of his face, while a truncated top hat showed the rest. One should explain that when a top hat becomes soiled by the wearer's perspiration, and relegated to the second-hand clothing shops, the crown is removed, the stained part cut away, and the shortened crown reset on the brim. The greybeard's hat was a testament to this process, having undergone it at least 3 times. Once before, on a freezing winter night, beside a fire made in a wash-tub to warm the homeless, I had seen such a hat. Indeed, I had seen the same greybeard, in only slightly different clothes. I recognized this interesting person, and as he approached, my heart began to pound in a most irrational manner. And I stood quite still in the shadow of the oak, terrified lest he see me. Luckily, he hitched past me on the opposite side of the street without turning his head my way. Once I felt reasonably sure that he had not observed me, I breathed out, "Heavens, what next?" Never removing my gaze from him, I watched as he turned the corner, picking his way along the wrought iron fence that surrounded Wimbrel Hall. Even after he had passed out of sight, I did not move from the shadow of the oak. I waited to see whether I might work him into my plan, meanwhile reviewing my case as I had reasoned it out. Lord Rodney Wimbrel takes a seat in the House of Lords. He worries, or perhaps is induced by Geoffrey to worry, that a long ago message his father never received may surface to embarrass him. Geoffrey quite plans to handle Rodney's career however he pleases, perhaps to enrich himself, perhaps simply for the pleasure of wielding power. Therefore Geoffrey, evidently a man with low companions and a taste for illicit action, undertakes, along with a thuggish friend, to retrieve the troublesome missing message. Failing to find the message, Geoffrey and friend kidnap Mrs. Tupper. Lord Rodney Wimbrel, a pleasant, well-meaning gentleman, is probably quite upset by this turn of events, but, lacking in backbone, has not done anything about it. Perhaps I, Enola Holmes, by confronting him, might be able to... Almost as if on cue, the genteel of impoverished greybeard reappeared on the far corner of Wimbrel Hall's wrought iron fence. Yes, it was as I thought. Still I waited. The elderly loiterer, having completed a circuit of the Wimbrel grounds, nevertheless limped back along the front of the property, covering the same ground again. Apparently, as I had suspected, he intended to stay in the neighborhood for a while. I had good reason to feel afraid. Very afraid, indeed, of what I was about to do, yet as he approached, a rueful warmth swelled my heart and made me smile. Then, straightening myself like a soldier, and holding my head high, I stepped forward. Across the street, directly in front of the greybeard, I strode, swinging my satchel and making sure that he saw me, although I did not look at him. Progressing up the pavement to Wimbrel Hall boldly, I mounted its marble steps, crossed the flambeau-lit apron, and knocked at the massive mahogany front door. The butler, opening this portal, regarded my solitary and spinsterish merino-clad personage with rather less favor than he might bestow upon an encroaching insect. He did not speak. In very decided tones I declared, "I am here to see Lord Wimbrel," adding before I could be refused, "and I feel quite certain that he will wish to receive me." The butler's eyebrows arched dangerously high, but my erect posture and crisp aristocratic accent somewhat reversed his first impression of me. As an aside, let me state that while a talented mimic such as my brother Sherlock, or dare I say it myself, can ape a lower-class accent with ease, the opposite, a lower-class person speaking with an upper-class accent, is quite impossible, or at least to my knowledge has never been done. Because of the quality of my H's... H's. Here you go, some more words. Then the butler condescended to speak. "Your card, miss?" "I carry no card, and I bear no name." This rehearsed line I flung out with quite an air of drama. "If you will allow me to compose and send a brief note to Lord Wimbrel, he shall see me." The drama was part of my plan. I maintain that butlers, although they show none, do possess humanity, including curiosity. The man simply had to wonder what I was all about, and therefore stepped aside, waving me into Wimbrel Hall. So large was the marble-floored entryway into which I stepped, and so cold, and so wallpapered, as it were, with elk skulls, samurai swords, Egyptian sarcophagi, elephant-foot umbrella stands, odalisques, and bas-relief cupids and curios of every kind, that it might as well have been a museum. There were no chairs, nor did the butler offer me a seat in the library, but left me standing along with the statuary as he went off to fetch writing materials. I took the opportunity to examine the outgoing post that had collected on a silver tray near the front door, and, yes, amongst the letters I saw some addressed in black-inked, vicious, club and javelin-styled handwriting that I could hardly mistake. The sender, the Honorable G. Wimbrel, Geoffrey. Repressing a shiver, I hoped I would not need to meet him. The other letters from Lord R. Wimbrel displayed a rather pedestrian hand. Rodney appeared to be, well, one could not say for sure, especially as, being a lord and peer, he might have a secretary to address his post for him. Hearing the butler returning, I transferred my gaze to a whatnot displaying cups made of ostrich eggs. Approaching without a word, the servant presented me a writing stand furnished with good quality paper, pen, inkwell, and its own candle, already lit to provide light by which to write. But I scowled at these arrangements. "Bring me sealing wax," I told him imperiously, and also with an air, I hoped, of mystery. "Of what color, my lady?" I heard resentment and retort in his tone. Resentment because he knew I was asserting myself over him, for plain candle wax would have sufficed to seal the missive. Resentment also because its being sealed would prevent him from reading it as he bore it to his master. And retort because color was symbolic. He was challenging me to show my intentions. But at the same time I noticed that I had been promoted from Miss to my lady. "Why, red, of course," I told him, "scarlet rather than crimson," and let him make of that whatever he would. As he went off to get wax, I took pen in hand, concentrated on making my script large and strong, and wrote, "I have the message for the bird. Will exchange for Mrs. T. Without further ado. If turned away, I will go to the police. Leaving this unsigned, I blotted it dry and folded it so as to conceal its content before the butler, returning, had a chance to peek over my shoulder. Accepting from him a stick of red sealing wax and lighting it at the candle, I dripped a blood-colored puddle onto the paper's fold where it congealed. Wishing I had a signet ring or something similarly dramatic with which to press it flat, I made do with the heel of my hand. When I was sure the seal had quite hardened, I gave the missive to the butler. Off he went to deliver it to his master, leaving me standing beneath a carved wooden stair of several African war masks. For quite some time I began to worry whether I had perhaps miscalculated. Should I have formulated my message in roses and daisies? Would that have made a stronger impression? But no, it would not have been understood at all, for if Lord Rodney knew anything of the code, he, or rather his errand boy, Geoffrey, would have recognized it on the crinoline. I quite wished I knew a bit more of Lord Rodney. Was the namby-pamby handwriting his? Perhaps because he seemed quite dependent upon Geoffrey. Oh dear, what if he were consulting with that villain right now? Alas, and indeed, such proved to be the case, for when the butler eventually returned, and silently beckoned me to follow, he escorted me to the shadowy, smoke-filled billiards-room, a place no proper lady would ever willingly set foot, and there, across the expanse of the green felt-topped gaming table, I found myself facing both young Wimbrels at once. That's the end of chapter 12. The letter H. That's what H's mean. Makes sense. Yep. Makes sense. So, it's the, phonetic way of writing the letter H. Very nice. Alrighty. Drink some more tea. It's appropriate. So here's my question. Do you call it a tea? You call it a teacup, but then you can also call it a coffee cup or a coffee mug. So, can you call something a tea mug? Or is it just a teacup? That's my question of the day. Can you have a tea mug? Or is it just a teacup? And it's a coffee mug or a coffee cup are both appropriate terms. There you go. Question for the day. We're making good time, guys. We've only got 2 more chapters and the epilogue and the author's note, which I will be reading, and I will show you. Yeah. They also have a list of Morse code picture, so you can, brush up on your Morse code skills. Okay. Oh, thanks. I'm doing great. I know how to read. Alrighty. Chapter the 13th. Lounging with cigars in hand, they received me, leaning upon their cue sticks, their attitude so insulting that I began to fear Lord Rodney might prove to be just such a villain as his younger brother. So similar were their oval, symmetrical faces and democratically blunt, pleasant features that one might have mistaken them for twins. I found no difficulty, however, in telling which was which, simply by the expression of their eyes. Lord Rodney's gaze was open and anxious, whereas his brother Geoffrey's was hooded like a cobra. He did not speak for a long moment. To tell the truth, I could not speak, in terror of the encounter. All the words I had prepared turned coward and fled my mind like conscripts deserting a battlefield. But I managed, I thought and hoped, to keep my spine stiff and my head high, and facing them I tried to glare rather than stare. I hoped my silence therefore seemed like scorn. I hoped also that I seemed considerably older than my 14 years. Such usually seems to be the effect of my height, my figure-augmenting underpinnings, and my sharp features. Lord Rodney, I noticed, put down both his cue stick and his cigar at once, and nervously he broke into speech. So, you are the nameless one who sent in such a mysterious note, of which we understand nothing? I assure you you are acting under some absurd misapprehension, my lady. Lady? That's no lady, Geoffrey corrected his brother with quite a preening air of indifference. That's the lodger. Aha! I cried. Bless Geoffrey's callous comportment and deplorable manners. He infuriated me, and instantly I found my voice. "And you say you know nothing of this affair. How dare you trifle with me?" Although Joffrey was the one who had aroused my ire, nevertheless I spoke straight to Lord Rodney, as if his younger brother were of no account. So better to irk him. "Kidnapping is a serious matter. Police and press can be hushed up with money, of course, but not Florence Nightingale. How do you think she would react if she knew what you had done? To whom do you think she would address her first 100 letters? And she will know if you do not act promptly to set the situation to rights. She has hired the famous detective, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "Bosh and wind," broke in Joffrey. "How can this girl possibly know anything of—" I turned on him. "Florence Nightingale received me in her chamber, as you would know if you had followed me there the second time I visited her, and if you were not so busy abducting a defenseless, respectable, elderly woman—" "I am not responsible for that," Lord Rodney cried out in a tone that would have been more appropriate emanating from Mrs. Tupper. "I never expected—" "Shut up!" Geoffrey barked at him. But at the same time I looked upon Lord Rodney, with a far more kindly gaze, reassuring him. "I quite believe you never expected the matter to go so far, or I would not be here talking to—" "Balderdash!" the hot-blooded Joffrey exploded. "He told me to get the message any way I had to, so I did what needed to be done, and now he will not let me dispose of the old woman. He thinks we can just let her go, and you, too, I suppose. Well, at least one son of our father has some guts." With which coarse utterance, in a single moment, not giving even so much warning as a coiling snake might have done, he darted to seize me. Were it not that the billiards table stood between us, he would have had me. But he needed to go around the obstacle, giving me just enough time to whip up my dagger and menace him with its stiletto-like 8-inch steel blade. He stopped. "You are not to lay hands on me," I told him softly between my teeth as he froze, staring, "for 2 reasons. This is one." I cocked my uplifted dagger so that the gaslight shone more prettily upon its blade. "The other is that my brother has seen me enter this house, and is waiting near the gate to see me come out again." By my fickle luck, arguably, either good or bad, this was true. Sherlock Holmes had come here, presumably by following the same reasoning as I had, although arriving at his conclusions a bit more quickly. The greybeard loitering in the street was the great detective in disguise. And I realized, rather to my own amazement, I did trust my older brother with my life, although not with my freedom. If I fail to appear within a reasonable time, he will take action, and I assure you, you will find him a most formidable adversary. Silence followed, and there we stood like a tableau, I with my back to the wall and my dagger raised. Joffrey poised a mere 2 paces from me with the sheerest evil in his eyes, and Lord Rodney on the other side of the billiards table. I did not, of course, chance a look at him, but I imagined he might be wringing his hands. Everything depended on Lord Rodney. And with that thought, the essence of my planned appeal came back to me, and I addressed him with it, although necessarily in a very abbreviated form. "Lord Rodney," I said levelly, "yours is the title of Lord Wimbrel. Yours is the seat in the House of Lords. Yours is the authority." With my left hand I reached into the pocket centered under the front drapery of my dress, where I had at the ready what I needed. I drew it out, and feeling at the wire hanger on its back to make sure I had it upright, for I could not look away from the dastardly Joffrey, not even for an instant, I held it up, facing it towards Lord Rodney, confronting him with a small portrait in silhouette. The Honourable Sidney Wimbrel, at Embley, summer, 1853. His father. "Lord Rodney Wimbrel," I addressed that peripheral individual, "I show you the likeness of a great statesman. His place deserves to be held by a worthy scion. How much longer—" Joffrey shouted at him. "You fool, don't just stand there! Hit her with your stick! How much longer are you going to allow your brother's regrettable impulses to shame your father's name?" He did not answer either of us, but out of the corner of my eye I saw him move, reaching for something, stiffening. I put the silhouette down upon the billiards table lest I need both hands to defend myself. But no, he was not hefting a cue stick. Rather he had grasped the bell-pull, summoning a servant, probably the butler. Another tall, strong, and most unprepossessing man. Oh dear. The billiards-room door opened, and indeed so, I glimpsed a black-suited, poker-straight, looming form, but I did not dare look away from Joffrey, not even for an eye-blink to see whether the butler had managed to remain expressionless. And how long the moment seemed, how the silence stretched as I held my ground, waiting to see what Lord Rodney would do. I am sure the butler quite wondered the same thing, although his voice sounded no less wooden than usual as he inquired, "You rang, my lord?" He addressed Lord Rodney, of course, but Joffrey burst out, "For God's sake, Billings, fetch the footman and a rope so we can quell this ugly wench. Silence! I give the orders." Lord Rodney's voice wavered, nevertheless. His were the words that mattered. "Billings, kindly escort the Honourable Joffrey to his chambers and have him remain there." "What?" Joffrey roared, turning on his brother and making towards him as if to attack him, much as he wished to attack me. But Billings strode in and caught him by both arms from behind. Joffrey shouted and flailed as if he intended to create considerable unpleasantness. Lord Rodney rang the bell again as he retreated. "By all means, have the footman assist you if necessary," he told Billings, and gesturing for me to come with him, he exited the room by another door. "Do please put that frightening thing away," he told me the moment we set foot in the corridor. I sheathed my dagger, but he seemed unwilling to turn his back on me, having me walk ahead of him as we made our way upstairs. I had expected he would take me to a parlor or library or some such quiet place where we could sit and negotiate terms, mutually agreeing how to exchange my message for his hostage. But instead, up 3 flights of stairs we went without a word. Wide and gracious stairs in the front of the house, not narrow backways, so I did not begin to feel afraid until he led, or rather herded me, towards what I realized must be the top of one of the mansion's white marble towers. Quite a good place for a makeshift prison. I stopped where I was, turning to look at Lord Rodney's face, and he halted, submitting to my scrutiny. Although very pale, and rather down in the mouth, he seemed composed. "If you wish me truly to be Lord Wimborne, worthy of my father's name," he said, sounding not particularly strong, but not too unsteady either, "then you must agree to trust me. Done?" And indeed, what was my alternative? To run away, leaving Mrs. Tupper to her fate? I hesitated only a moment before I answered, "Very well. Done." With a weary nod, he beckoned me forward to a narrow, heavy, dark door. He produced a large key and turned it in the lock. Opening the door and standing aside, he motioned for me to enter. I confess that I did not immediately walk in. Rather, I paused in the doorway of a small room, furnished with numerous gas lamps and sconces of candles, by the shining light of which I saw, not necessarily in this order, colorful chintz curtains, a brass bed plump with pillows and quilts, a vase of fragrant apple blossoms, a plate of fresh strawberries, a young maid sitting in a straight chair with her hands folded, waiting as if something else might be needed, a table upon which stood a stereopticon, beside an overstuffed easy-chair, in which, propped up by pillows as she viewed the clever three-dimensional images that had been provided for her amusement, sat Mrs. Tupper. My feelings can scarcely be imagined, so strong and strangely mixed were they. Relief so great that it made me weak in the knees, but also astonishment, irrational outrage, and a bit of envy. Nobody gave me fresh strawberries or a stereopticon. Altogether, I found myself nearly overcome by disorderly emotion, which I had no time to discipline. For at the moment I saw Mrs. Tupper, she also saw me. With a mynah bird cry, she tottered to her feet and toppled towards me. I hurried forward lest she fall. She hastened to fling her arms around my waist. "Miss Michelle!" She was weeping, and so I must admit was I, and the maid rose, curtsied, and then exited the room, no doubt at Lord Rodney's silent signal. He stood just inside the door waiting for the tempest to calm, with the look of one who has forgot his umbrella. "Oh, Miss Michelle!" iterated Mrs. Tupper. "Oh, Miss Michelle, I'm that glad to see you, I am, Miss Michelle." Patting her head, which came barely to my shoulder, I noted that she wore a crisp new white house cap with lavender ribbons, a new lavender dress to match. Speaking wryly, in an attempt to dry out my feelings, I said, "It appears you have not been mistreated." "Eh?" She put her head up like a turtle, a hand behind one ear. Instantly, all seemed so annoyingly normal that I calmed. I sighed deeply, then bawled directly into her ear, "You're all right?" "Oh, yes, thanks to this'n." Still tearful, she bobbed towards Lord Rodney. "He's a kind gentleman as ever wore spats, but the other'n, he wants to throw me in the river." I have never in my life worn spats, and I have never in my life worn spats, and the other'n, said Lord Rodney with an undertone of dark humor in his voice, "will be on a ship to Australia within the week." Mrs. Tupper, of course, could not hear him, cried, "I've been that scared, I have." Poor dear. Of course, knowing she had been terribly frightened, not knowing who these people were, or what they wanted, or which one was older, or younger, or more likely to get his way. There, muttering soothing inanities, even though I knew quite well she could not hear me. I patted her humped back, speaking over her head to Lord Rodney. An excellent idea. Your brother's talents will be much more useful and appreciated in such a wild place, I told him quite sincerely. But I am afraid I cannot remember what he replied, for when I directed my eyes towards him, I saw a face looking in at the window behind him. This was most startling, considering that we stood in a room 4 stories above the ground. Equally startling was the face, its sharp nose actually pressed to the glass, making a white triangle amidst a rack of grey hair. Yet rather than jumping and screaming, I smiled. Indeed, I gave my brother Sherlock quite an impudent look, imagining how he must be hanging on to the stonework outside. I dearly wished to stick out my tongue at him, but I could not, of course, or Lord Rodney would have seen. Instead, I inquired of that nervous person, "Might we go downstairs?" "Of course, Miss Michelle. That is your name, is it not?" It was not, strictly speaking, so I replied sweetly. There would be no point in my denying it. Mrs. Tupper possesses in you a remarkably loyal lodger, Miss Michelle. By all means, let us go where we can all sit down. Shall I order some tea? That would be delightful. That's the end of chapter 13. Oh, no worries. You guys can be as quiet as you like. Don't sweat it. A tea mug would be fine. I've never heard anybody call. Yeah, see, that's my question. I would imagine with the movie. Oh, thanks. Hi, Riddy. Welcome. Glad to have you. I think with this film, I mean, I haven't heard any updates on it either, but I do know that originally Millie Bobby Brown was slated to play Enola, and I would imagine that with the delay on Stranger Things, on the Stranger Things season 3, and with her involvement in other films, that it's kind of just been pushed back. Alternatively, I did hear that Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law is expected to have a third movie that hopefully is planned to come out in 2020, which of course has been delayed because of Robert Downey Jr.'s involvement in the Marvel Universe films. So that's the last I heard. A couple weeks ago I read that online, but you never know. So I would expect that they're still in the works to make these movies, but I would imagine that it would take quite a while, since Millie Bobby Brown's other projects have been kind of delayed and pushed back. Yeah, I would expect. I mean, I'm looking forward to both films, and that's one reason that I wanted to start reading these books, is because I read these books in like, I got them from the library and read them when they were really new, which I think was like 2008. This book was published 2009, so yeah, so I think this was the last book that I started. I actually don't even know. No, you know what? I think I started The Case of the Peculiar Pink Fan and then never actually got to this book. I may have gotten it from the library and just never had time to crack it. So, anyways, we're on the home stretch, people. And then I do think I am going to start the next book. So I'm going to finish this book, and then I'm going to press through this last chapter, the epilogue and the author's note, and then probably stop the stream and restart it with the next book. So don't run away. We'll be... I know, I finally cracked the book. I know, I said at the beginning I'm just a big fat liar for not finishing this series before the end of 2018, so I'm a really big disappointment to the world, so... But hopefully we'll press on through and get them done soon. Alrighty. Chapter the 14th. The negotiations, in a rather grandiose sitting room, took some time. Lord Rodney required a great deal of reassuring, yet at the same time I wished him to give Mrs. Tupper a great deal of money. Those two objectives were difficult to reconcile, or to accomplish simultaneously. I tried to reason with him. Mrs. Tupper has no idea of your name, or your brother's name, or who you are, or where she has been taken. Is this not so? He looked ruefully upon the old woman, who, much comforted by tea and my presence, had dozed off in her blue velvet armchair. Yes, I believe that is correct. Doubtless you have noticed, also, that she is somewhat hampered in her ability to communicate. True. And she has not a Oh, sorry, that was the garbage truck outside. I thought something crazy was going on. And she has not a vindictive bone in her body. Once safely home, with some recompense for her trouble, she will say nothing more of the matter. No East Ender ever willingly speaks to the police. What about you? In your note you said you would go to the authorities. I said what I felt was necessary at the time. Surely now that you have met me you understand that I can be discreet. To the contrary, I understand mostly that you can brandish a dagger. Just as any sensible woman would do under the circumstances. He eyed me doubtfully. You're no ordinary woman. I fear I rolled my eyes. I have trusted you. Now you must trust me. Once you have provided for Mrs. Tupper's financial security in her old age... You want no money for yourself? He interrupted suspiciously. None, I assure you. And you will tell Florence Nightingale nothing of any of this? Nothing at all. I see no reason why I should ever set foot in her gracious home again. Then you promise me no ill consequences? None at all. For myself, I was thinking bitterly the consequences would be far worse than any he faced. Because Sherlock knew of Mrs. Tupper, I would have to give up lodging with her and find myself a new place at once. Unless, as might very well be the case, Sherlock were to catch me tonight, immediately upon my exit from Wimbrel Hall. All too aware that he was waiting for me, from time to time I caught a glimpse of him skulking outside the sitting-room windows. Focusing with difficulty on Lord Rodney, I continued. Certainly you can see that I bear you, personally, not the slightest ill will, and for the house of Wimbrel I cherish only the greatest respect. Indeed, I share Florence Nightingale's high opinion. And so I wheedled for a considerable length of time. Eventually, after much coaxing and many promises, a rather handsome sum changed hands. I am sure that poor Lord Rodney believed, despite all my protestations to the contrary, that he was bribing me for silence, and I reached into my satchel and presented his lordship with a tangle of blue ribbons embroidered with posies. Understandably, he seemed taken aback. What's this? The missing message, I told him, and here's the way I worked it out. I handed him the papers on which I had penciled the code. Then I stood and walked over to touch Mrs. Tupper upon the shoulder, awakening her as I told Lord Rodney. We should go now. I would be obliged if you would summon your carriage. This was very necessary in order for me to escape my brother, for certainly Mrs. Tupper could not run or climb trees with me. I will do nothing of the sort. Lord Rodney sounded all too much as if he had thoroughly discovered he was indeed Lord Wimbrel. Worse, he sounded peevishly wrought, as if he had expected something more to his masculine taste for money. You are going nowhere. Sit down and explain this nonsense. It's not nonsense. Although I should have known better, his temper caught me off guard, and my tone heightened to match his. It has cost me a great deal of trouble, and heaven only knows how things would have gone if it were not that, just then, a considerable crash resounded upstairs, and shouts and the sound of feet pounding down the stairway, and a great deal of hubbub throughout the house as Geoffrey Wimbrel thundered into view, pursued by 2 footmen in buckle shoes, stockings, knee breeches, red jackets, and white-powdered wigs. It would make an interesting study why decorative servants must dress like the upper classes of the prior century. Most impractical. One footman's wig had been jolted askew, and the others flew right off as they pelted after his younger lordship. At the foot of the stairs, the butler, Billings, joined the pursuit, bellowing unnecessarily, "He's broken out, my lord!" Already Lord Rodney had jumped up and darted towards the large, museum-like entryway through which his younger brother was running for the door. I also leapt up to go see, and Mrs. Tupper, at her best hunchbacked speed, did likewise. Indeed, shrieks and yells, both feminine and masculine, sounded from the direction of the kitchen, and other nether regions as the entire household came running to observe the fracas. Seemingly out of nowhere, a crowd assembled. The 2 footmen, the butler, and Lord Rodney attached themselves to Geoffrey like bulldogs to a bear, but even their combined strength failed to halt his charge for the door. They clung to his coattails and clawed at his shoulders as he lifted the latches and turned the bolts, flinging the door open. Clearly visible in the firelight of the flambeau, on the marble apron just outside the door waited a remarkably tall, angular personage with a great deal of unkept grey hair and beard. I was perhaps the only one not totally astonished. Except, apparently, Joffrey. Enraged or desperate beyond such petty sentiments as surprise, he took no pause. Tearing free of the annoyed people clinging to his back, he hurtled out the door as if to run right over the grey beard. But he ran instead into what might as well have been a bolt of lightning. Most swiftly and unexpectedly, the tall man slashed a chopping blow with his edgewise hand, one long leg extended. Alas, I cannot fully describe the maneuvers with which I believe, from the reference in the writings of Dr. Watson, demonstrated the Eastern martial art of jiu-jitsu, nor can I detail the single-handed combat that landed Joffrey on his back with the greybeard atop him, nor could I take pleasure in my brother's prowess, or in the astonishment of the onlookers observing a thin old man knocking down a strong young aristocrat. I retain only the most fragmentary memory of any of this, for I did not stay to watch. Instead, taking Mrs. Tupper by the hand, I hurried her towards the back of the house, intent on getting out there while everyone, including Sherlock, especially Sherlock, was busied at the front. Although Mrs. Tupper kept up the best pace she could, it was not good enough, so I actually caught her up in my arms, slung her slight weight over one shoulder, and ran with her through hallways and serving ways that were utterly deserted. So also was the kitchen. Out its door and up the steps of its area we scuttled, making a hasty escape through the unusual maze of outbuildings, summer kitchen, tool shed, dog kennel, carriage house, until we reached the back gate, which stopped us but a moment. Such safeguards meant to keep intruders out are simple enough to open from the inside. Still carrying Mrs. Tupper, although I confess I was starting to breathe quite hard, I trotted along a back lane until I achieved a street. There, under the murky glow of a gas lamp and out of sight of Wimbrel Hall, I felt a bit more secure. Setting Mrs. Tupper down on her own two tottery feet, I stopped to examine her for signs of damage. "Are you all right?" I asked, softly, for I did not wish to attract the attention of the neighborhood by shouting. I hoped Mrs. Tupper might be able to read my lips. She seemed to. "Miss Michelle," she quavered, her voice as well as her eyes rather watery, "I'm so everlastingly obliged to you. Shh!" I had to look away from her, for in that moment it truly smote me, with great pain to my heart, that I must leave her. And then I, Enola, whose name spelled backwards spells alone, would be even more lonely than ever. For Mrs. Tupper, my deaf, elderly landlady, who served the most dreadful suppers, had nevertheless been sometimes like a mother to me. "Oh, Mum, where are you?" It was the worst thing I could have thought for my mother. More and more, although I tried to deny it, I felt irrationally certain that I would never see Mum again. That she had succumbed to old age, and the gypsies, illiterate nomads, had left her somewhere in an unmarked grave. "Stop it, Enola." Barely holding back tears, I took Mrs. Tupper's arm and hurried her along the street until at last, seeing a cab approaching, I hailed it. Inside the concealment of the four-wheeler, I handed over to Mrs. Tupper the money I had extracted from Lord Rodney Wimbrel, shushing her astonished protests. I needed to feel sure that she would never go hungry or lack for means. I saw to it that she tucked the 100-pound notes deeply into her bosom. When we arrived at her lowly hovel in the East End of London, we both got out, but I ordered the cab to wait. Leaving Mrs. Tupper downstairs to exclaim over the ruin of her home, I ran up to my room, so no longer to be mine any more, where I thrust into a carpet-bag only my most comprising or irreplaceable possessions. My wig, facial emollients, and various other essentials of disguise, my extra dagger, all my money, and the little handmade booklet decorated with watercolor flowers which had been my mother's last gift to me. Running downstairs again with baggage in hand, I found Mrs. Tupper, showing more intelligence than I had credited her, waiting by the door, clutching to her bosom the carved wooden box that contained her meager lifetime of documents and mementos, with the most forlorn look on her face. "Miss Michelle, don't leave me here alone, not after what's happened," she implored. "I don't feel safe here, and it ain't home to me no more. Take me with you." Time seemed to spin in a circle, then come to a teetering off-balance halt. Take her along? If only my Mum had taken me along with her. But where? In what way? How could I possibly? Explosively, my mind countered its own consternation. Never mind the difficulties. Blast and confound Sherlock Holmes and Mycroft Holmes, too. Hang any danger they might pose to me. I simply could not leave Mrs. Tupper. Time whirled into motion, centered now. Come along, then, quickly. Her crumpled old face cleared as I took her by the hand. Together we scuttled into the cab. Where to now, miss? The driver asked. Quite cheerfully, I told him. I have no idea. Although surely I would soon enough. I had learned to trust the peculiar workings of my heart and mind. Just drive west. Thus forth, we sailed into London City. May, 1889. I cannot create embroidery any more. Florence Nightingale remarks with nostalgia, but no self-pity as she fingers a quantity of blue ribbon, winsomely stitched with 5-petaled daisies and little round roses that her visitor has deposited upon the counterpane of her bed. My hands can no longer manage a needle. Indeed, they are misshapen from constant writing, which is far more important. Needlecraft is a frivolous pursuit. Such are the thoughts of the once famous lady with the lamp, as she turns her placid attention to her visitor. You say Lord Rodney Wimbrel wishes me to have these. Why? Standing over her, for he has not been invited to have a seat, even though she has engaged Sherlock Holmes to help her, still his intrusion must not last long, the famous detective responds. Lord Wimbrel hopes in this way to convey that the matter is ended completely, and that he remains your most loyal admirer. And he wishes me to forget how the matter began. Although Lord Rodney takes his responsibility, Miss Nightingale, still one must consider his brother Geoffrey the instigator, and he shall instigate no more. His other choices being only worse, he has agreed to take ship to the colonies. Then I shall withhold judgment, and hope that Lord Rodney shows increased moral fortitude in the future. While speaking thoughtfully, Florence Nightingale scans the tall, lean, angular man of action, so exceedingly vertical in her serene horizontal surroundings. In his Miss Nightingale, she has heard gallantry, yes, but also a hint of condescension. She has not intended to speak to him of a certain tall girl of action, but, thrusting the embroidered ribbons to one side, she gestures for Sherlock Holmes to take a seat. When he has done so, she tells him in her customary soft and gentle manner, Doubtless you wonder why I did not attempt to stop your quite remarkable sister from taking such precipitous departure a few days ago. No, as he scowls and flings up one gloved hand trying to halt the conversation, let me speak. While I had no idea until you told me so, that Enola, is that her name? Enola is a mere child of 14. With far less than his usual courtesy, Sherlock Holmes interrupts. It would not matter if she were, as she appears to be 24. Would you let your daughter if you had one? But Florence Nightingale interrupts the interruption, sweetly and apparently tangentially. I know your mother, you realize, Sherlock. I knew your mother, you realize, Mr. Holmes. Evidently he does not realize, and the revelation staggers him somewhat, for he sits back in his armchair and watches the invalid, a remarkable woman, with her smooth face, her sleek hair parted in the old-fashioned manner, and shown off by her peculiar headgear. He studies Florence Nightingale from beneath troubled brows. Eudora Vernet. Eudora Vernet. I think that's how I've said it before. A thoroughly admirable woman, the lady with the lamp speaks on. Totally and efficiently committed to reform. She chose to espouse women's rights, whereas I turned my attention to the plight of the sick and wounded. But we quite respected each other. Have you had any word from her, Mr. Holmes? You are aware that she is missing, then? No, I have heard nothing. He hesitates only an instant before asking. Have you? Ah, he did care for his mum. I am sorry to say that I have not. Perhaps she has run off to the Crimea. Mocking herself slightly, Florence Nightingale speaks lightly, yet with care. Being who I am, I would hardly restrain any woman, no matter how tender her years. Sherlock Holmes leans forward, cutting her off with a gesture like a jiu-jitsu chop. And interestingly, he speaks not of Enola Holmes, but of Eudora. My brother and I had quarreled with Mother. Now, looking back, it all seems like a great deal of nonsense, he says bluntly, and with an unexpected bitterness. Still, there was no reason for her to... But can you not see, Florence Nightingale interjects with the greatest soft-spoken authority, that from her point of view there was every reason, obviously, and your sister also, a few days ago, seemed to have the most compelling reasons for her actions. Miss Nightingale hesitates, then decides to say it. She seemed quite terrified of you. Although he does not actually wince, she sees how her words strike like a blow. Leaning his forearms upon his knees, he clasps his hands and looks down at them. Patiently, Miss Nightingale waits for some other response. I cannot deny it, he says at length, yet I cannot by any application of my considerable mental abilities understand why she fears me so. I would never do anything to harm her, and she knows that. I'm sure she has from time to time displayed unmistakable affection for me. A good nurse knows when to be silent and let the patient talk. Florence Nightingale waits some more. My brother Mycroft and I want for the girl only what would be in her own best interests. Sherlock Holmes goes on, some further education at a good boarding school. Ah! Suddenly and completely Florence Nightingale understands. You have threatened her with boarding school. Sherlock Holmes raises a puzzled, almost boyish gaze to her face. Why, whatever is the threat? Good heavens, didn't your mother tell you? Although, actually, his ignorance is no more extensive than that of other males. The sufferings of an upper-class girl in a typical boarding school are only slightly less severe than those of an imprisoned criminal upon a treadmill. I speak of painful physical rigors that result invariably in deformity and sometimes in death. The great detective sits with his mouth ajar, evidently at a loss. My good man, Florence Nightingale tells him gently, please forgive me for being quite sorry, they split the words. I gotta spell it out because I can't even read it. Unconscionably. Unconscionably. Maybe. Please forgive me for being quite unconscionably blunt, and indeed coarse, but I am an old woman, and as such, I will say what others won't. Thumbscrews are merciful compared with a fully tightened corset. It is a word never spoken in polite society, much less in mixed company. Hearing it, the man of action raises both hands in protest, and a flush of pink can be seen in his aquiline face, but Florence Nightingale perseveres. Why, she challenges his intellect, do you think fashionable women constantly faint, and die of the slightest ailment, much less childbirth? Or occasionally fade away and succumb even before reaching childbearing age? It is because they are compressed at the waist in a practice no more civilized than the binding of a Chinese woman's feet. Far beyond comfort, beyond health, small wonder your sister fears you. In fleeing boarding school, she is literally running for her life. But it simply cannot be as bad as you say, exclaimed Sherlock Holmes. Tradition, elegance, generations of ladies have survived. One might with similar logic say that traditionally generations of soldiers have survived wars, remarks Florence Nightingale. But then with the diplomatic instinct that has seen her through a lifetime of dealing with authoritative males, she turns the conversation mildly aside. I have never had a child, but I have had a sister, and I quite sympathize with your concern for yours, she assures her visitor. Perhaps Mrs. Tupper can tell you something of her whereabouts. From downstairs the piano resounds, filling the house with the majestic measures of Beethoven, and although neither the great detective nor the great reformer can see Mrs. Tupper right now, both know where she is, sitting directly beside the instrument, entranced and ecstatic because she can actually hear the music. With a bleak chuckle, Sherlock Holmes leans back in his chair. No, there is nothing to be got out of Mrs. Tupper, as I'm sure Enola knows quite well. The sheer audacity of the girl, he goes in, tones of mingled wonder and exasperation, never ceases to astonish me. For her to venture here, when a mere block away at Wimborne Hall I was still casting about for her trail, for her to drop off the old woman as if she were an expected visitor, smoothly Florence Nightingale puts in, but I am delighted to care for Mrs. Tupper in her old age. Very good of you, I am sure, he retorts rather abrasively, but then he corrects his tone. Would you also be so good as to send for me if my sister comes here to visit her? Florence Nightingale scarcely hesitates before she speaks, seemingly not addressing his question. You have an older brother, I recall. Mycroft, yes. Also a bachelor, a recluse, a misanthrope, indeed a misogynist, and quite set in his ways. How on earth does she know so much? The great detective scowls. I flatter myself that I have some small influence over him. Nevertheless, Mr. Holmes, his is the legal authority. How would I know if your sister were to come here? Says Florence Nightingale with sweetest, wide-eyed innocence. I never go downstairs. Sherlock Holmes, who who also possesses the instincts of a diplomat, knows when an impasse has been reached. Without further comment, he rises. Miss Nightingale, I am delighted to have met you, he tells her, standing by her bedside to take one of her half-crippled hands and bow over it. If I can ever be of further service, please do not hesitate to call upon me. His thoughts, however, as he takes his leave, are far from delighted. As he stalks past Mrs. Tupper in her rocking chair by the piano, Sherlock Holmes considers that Enola is sure to visit that elderly woman. Therefore, by deploying the Baker Street irregulars, his troop of street urchins, to watch the house, he has a very good chance of catching his sister. Confound him, bless the daredevil. Oh, so clever girl. But then what? Is there possibly any truth to the distressing and indelicate things that Florence Nightingale has told him? If Mum were here, might she tell him likewise? Ye gods! Is he losing his world-famous mind, wishing now that he could ask for the advice of his mother, which he would have utterly disregarded a year ago? His mother, whom he has been unable to locate? Confound everything! Why did that eccentric woman run away? And why did his sister then flee as well? And why does she continue to do so? Perhaps, and this is very difficult for the man of action to admit, perhaps he has been going about things all wrong, thinking he must take Enola in hand, for her own good? As he exits Florence Nightingale's gracious home for the first time in the great detective's brilliant mind, asks what, really, is his sister's... For the first time, the great detective's brilliant mind asks what, really, his sister's own good might be. Boarding school, education in the social graces, introduction to polite society, preparation for marriage. However proper and traditional, still, are these necessarily the best plans for Enola? That's the end. Here is the International Morse Code. Those of you who are wanting to decipher Morse code. Well, you can probably Google it, but you know, Google wasn't a huge thing in 2009. Alright, I'm going to read the author's note real quick. Author's note. Concerning the Crimean War and Florence Nightingale, I have done my best to adhere to documented facts. However, there is no evidence that Florence Nightingale engaged in secret communications. Her use of code is my own invention. After the war, the famous nurse did spend the rest of her life as an invalid. Why so is a question... Why so is a question hotly debated among scholars. No one is certain what caused Florence Nightingale's peculiar conduct. I took the liberty of giving it my own interpretation. She did indeed live in Mayfair, with a view of Hyde Park, although my description of her house is necessarily imaginary, as the original is gone. While it is true that Florence Nightingale was quite influential in politics and affairs of court, Lord Wimbrel and his sons are fictitious characters. And that's it. That's the end of the book. Everybody, we finally finished it. Yay! Sorry, I'm reading over your chat. Yeah, the invasion of garbage trucks. Never trust a Joffrey. Nope, don't do it. His name's spelled with a G though. Yeah, I definitely can't say that word. Unconscionably. Maybe that's it. Unconscionably. Thank you. Go back in time and replace the word for me, Riddy. I appreciate that. Alrighty, guys. Well, I am going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to come back and read, get started on the next book. So, please feel free to stick around. I'm going to actually stop the stream and restart it so that when I upload it to YouTube, it'll be in multiple parts. So, I will be back. If you want to stick around, please feel free to do so. If you can't stick around, thank you so much for joining. And you can definitely rewatch the next stream on either Twitch or YouTube. But thank you guys so much. I appreciate you being here. thanks for supporting this endeavor, and I'm sorry that it's come so late, but I will be back. I'm gonna get some music going just to have a decent outro, but I'll catch you guys later. And it'll take me a bit to set up the next one, but don't go too far.